The snow fell heavily outside the windows of Bollingen Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, 1906. Carl Jung, 31 years old with a neatly trimmed beard and penetrating eyes, sat across from Elizabeth, a patient whose intelligence and insight had captured his professional curiosity. The small office smelled of leather-bound books and wood polish, the ticking clock marking the passage of their session. "The women I treat," Jung said, carefully choosing his words, "often describe feelings of division, as if the person society expects them to be stands apart from who they truly are." Elizabeth's fingers traced the pattern of her skirt. "It's like living in two worlds simultaneously, one visible, one hidden." Jung nodded, making a note in his journal. Later that evening, by lamplight in his study, he wrote, "There is something profound in the feminine experience that our current psychological frameworks fail to capture. It is not merely hysteria or neurosis, as my colleagues suggest, but perhaps an authentic response to the profound limitations imposed upon the feminine spirit." This moment would mark the beginning of Jung's departure from conventional thinking, the first step toward his revolutionary understanding of the collective unconscious and the powerful, often suppressed feminine aspects of the human psyche. Vienna, 1908. Smoke hung heavy in Freud's study as 7 men from the Psychoanalytic Society debated the foundations of the human mind. Jung felt the weight of Freud's expectations. The older man had already declared him his intellectual heir, the Joshua to my Moses. "The sexual drive alone cannot explain the patterns I'm observing," Jung said, aware of the tension his words created. "Particularly in women, there appears to be a spiritual dimension, a collective wisdom that transcends individual experience." Freud's expression hardened. "You risk undermining everything we've built, Carl." That night, in his hotel room, Jung experienced a dream that would haunt him for years, a great flood sweeping across Europe, drowning the old world and its certainties. He awoke understanding that his intellectual journey would require courage. He would have to challenge not just Freud, but an entire system of thought that relegated the feminine to secondary status. The Zurich lake stretched before them, its surface catching the golden light of late afternoon. Jung walked beside his wife Emma, their conversation turning toward his growing disagreements with Freud. "He sees only the surface," Jung said. "The sexual repression, yes, but not the deeper spiritual hunger beneath it." Emma, herself trained in psychology, considered this carefully. "Perhaps what you're sensing is that women's experiences have been interpreted primarily through a masculine lens. Our dreams, our symbols, our ways of knowing have been translated rather than understood on their own terms." Jung stopped walking, struck by the simple truth of her observation. Emma had articulated something he had been circling for years. That evening, he began sketching the first diagrams of what would later become his theory of archetypes, universal patterns in the collective unconscious that manifested differently but recognizably across cultures and individuals. 13. Jung's private Praxis in Küsnacht. The walls lined with artifacts from various cultures, masks, statues, symbolic objects that Jung used to illustrate the universality of certain psychological patterns. "I've identified several recurring archetypes in the feminine psyche," Jung explained to a small group of colleagues. "The mother, the maiden, the wise woman, the temptress, but these are not merely roles imposed by society. They represent profound psychological realities, energies that exist within all of us, regardless of gender." Jung unveiled his most controversial theory that men carried within them an unconscious feminine aspect, the anima, and women an unconscious masculine aspect, the animus. These internal figures shaped how individuals related to the opposite sex and to their own deeper nature. "The tragedy of modern life," Jung continued, his voice dropping, is that we have severed our connection to these internal figures. Men are cut off from their emotional wisdom, women from their authority. Both suffer for it. The cannons of World War I echoed across Europe. Jung, exempt from military service due to medical reasons, watched as civilization tore itself apart. His consulting room. He saw patients traumatized not just by personal wounds, but by collective horror. What we're witnessing, Jung told his colleague Tony Wolfe during a late-night discussion, is the eruption of the collective shadow, all that Western civilization has repressed and denied, particularly its feminine values of connection, intuition, and relatedness. Jung began to see the war as psychological as much as political, the result of a profound imbalance in the European psyche. In his journal, he wrote, "A culture that systematically devalues the feminine principles of life inevitably turns toward destruction. What we call progress has been built on a foundation of disconnection from nature, from the body, from the wisdom of the feminine." 1919. The war ended, but Jung entered his own personal crisis, what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. For hours each day, he descended into active imagination, engaging directly with the figures and symbols that emerged from his unconscious. Among these figures was a wise old woman he called Salome, who challenged his intellectual certainties and offered guidance from a place of ancient feminine wisdom. Through these encounters, Jung began to understand that the feminine was not merely a psychological construct, but a pathway to wholeness, for individuals and for civilization. In his Red Book, the private journal where he recorded these experiences, Jung wrote, "The feminine does not wish to be understood as an abstract principle, but to be experienced as a living reality. Only through this experience can we heal the split that threatens to destroy not just individual psyches, but our collective future." By the 1920s, Jung's ideas had attracted a circle of brilliant women, analysts, scholars, and patients who recognized in his work a validation of their own experiences. Marie-Louise von Franz, Yolanda Jacobi, Esther Harding, and others formed the core of what would become analytical psychology. During a seminar in 1925, Jung acknowledged their contribution. "My understanding of the feminine has been shaped profoundly by the women who have brought their dreams, their insights, and their criticisms to this work. They have been not just students, but teachers." This collaborative approach, unusual for the time, allowed Jung to refine his theories in dialogue with women's lived experiences rather than imposing theories upon them. The feminine was no longer an object of study, but an active participant in the creation of psychological knowledge. Zurich, 1932. Jung addressed a gathering on the psychological challenges facing modern women. "The modern woman stands at a crossroads," he said. "She has gained access to education, to profession, to public life, all traditionally masculine domains. But this progress carries a shadow. Many women find themselves alienated from their deeper feminine nature, trying to succeed according to masculine values while denying their own wisdom." Jung proposed that true liberation wasn't about women becoming more like men, but about society recognizing and valuing feminine principles, intuition, relatedness, emotional intelligence, cyclical awareness as equal to masculine ones. "The most radical act," he concluded, may be for women to trust and articulate their own experience of the world, rather than adapting to perspectives that have rendered that experience invisible. Spring, 1935. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Jung's office as Christiana, a 42-year-old professor of mathematics, described the dream that had brought her to analysis. "I stood before a locked door in an ancient stone building," she said, her voice steady, despite her evident discomfort. A key materialized in my hand, but when I tried to use it, my arm froze. Behind me, a crowd gathered, watching, waiting for me to fail. Jung leaned forward slightly, his eyes attentive but not intrusive. "And how did you feel in this moment?" "Divided," Christiana replied after a long pause. "Part of me desperately wanted to open the door. Another part was terrified of what might lie behind it." Over the coming months, Jung worked with Christiana to understand her dream. A brilliant academic who had sacrificed personal relationships for professional achievement, she embodied the modern woman's struggle, successful by external standards, but increasingly disconnected from her emotional life. "Your mathematical mind has served you well," Jung told her during a pivotal session. "But there is another kind of intelligence within you that speaks through images, through feelings, through the body. This is not lesser wisdom. It is simply a different language." Through their work together, Christiana began to recognize how she had internalized the cultural devaluation of feminine qualities, emotional sensitivity, intuitive knowing, cyclical awareness. Her breakthrough came not through abandoning her intellectual achievements, but through integrating them with these previously rejected aspects of herself. "The locked door in your dream," Jung suggested in their final session, was not merely a personal symbol, but a collective one. Many women stand before that threshold today, key in hand, uncertain whether they dare to enter rooms that have been forbidden to them for centuries. In his final decades, Jung turned increasingly to alchemy as a symbolic system that captured the process of psychological integration he called individuation. Central to this was the coniunctio, the sacred marriage of masculine and feminine. Principles, what the alchemists sought in matter, Jung explained to a patient in 1945, we seek in the psyche, the reconciliation of opposites, the integration of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow. Jung proposed that psychological wholeness for individuals and societies required honoring both masculine and feminine values. Neither was superior, both were essential. This represented his most radical departure from the patriarchal thinking of his time, suggesting that the path forward lay not in domination of one principle over another, but in their dynamic balance. Summer, 1952. The stone tower Jung had built with his own hands at Bollingen stood against the evening sky, its rough-hewn walls holding the warmth of the day. Inside, a fire crackled as Jung sat with a small circle of his closest colleagues, Emma Jung, Marie-Louise von Franz, Barbara Hanna, and Jolande Jacobi. Outside, Lake Zurich lapped gently at the shore. "What troubles me," Jung said, pouring wine into simple clay cups, "is how easily my work on the feminine principle could be misunderstood, reduced to stereotypes or used to confine rather than liberate." Marie-Louise von Franz, her sharp intellect tempered by decades of clinical work, nodded. "The danger lies in concretizing these archetypal patterns, turning fluid psychological realities into rigid prescriptions." "Precisely," Jung agreed. The Aisha mother archetype, for instance, is not merely about biological motherhood, but about a quality of consciousness, nurturing, containing, transforming. These are capacities within all human beings, regardless of gender. Barbara Hanna, who had been quietly listening, spoke up, "Yet we cannot ignore the reality that women's actual experiences in the world are shaped by cultural expectations and limitations." A thoughtful silence fell over the group. The firelight played across their faces. These remarkable women, who had devoted their lives to deepening psychological understanding alongside Jung, often at great personal cost, in a world that remained skeptical of women's intellectual contributions. "Perhaps," Emma Jung suggested, her voice carrying the weight of her own journey as both wife and colleague. The greatest challenge is holding the tension between the archetypal and the personal, understanding how universal patterns manifest in individual lives shaped by particular historical and cultural circumstances. Jung looked at his wife with deep appreciation. This is why I need your perspectives, all of you. My own vision is necessarily limited by my experience as a man in this time and place. The work we're doing can only approach truth when it incorporates multiple ways of seeing. That evening marked a pivotal moment in Jung's thinking, a recognition that understanding the feminine mind required not just theoretical insight, but ongoing dialogue with women themselves. The tower at Bollingen, built as a physical manifestation of Jung's inner world, had become a space where true exchange could happen, where the feminine was not merely theorized about, but actively present in shaping psychological understanding. Winter, 1960. Snow blanketed the garden outside Jung's study in Küsnacht. At 85, his health was failing, but his mind remained clear as crystal. On his desk lay the manuscript of his final major work, Approaching the Unconscious, which would later be published as part of Man and His Symbols. Jung had insisted that the book be accessible to general readers, not just specialists, a departure from his typically dense academic writing. He believed that his insights into the feminine dimension of consciousness were too important to remain confined to professional circles. Marie-Louise von Franz entered the study, bringing tea and sitting across from her mentor and friend of nearly 40 years. "I've finished reviewing the manuscript," she said, placing a folder of notes beside his papers. Jung smiled wearily. "And your verdict?" "You've never written more clearly about the anima and animus," she replied. "But there's something missing in the section on how women experience the unconscious directly, not just as reflected through men's projections." Instead of defensiveness, Jung showed genuine curiosity. "Tell me." For the next hour, von Franz shared her observations, how women's experience of the unconscious often manifested differently, how their relationship to symbolism sometimes followed different patterns, how their individuation journeys frequently involved reclaiming authority rather than vulnerability. Jung listened intently, occasionally making notes in the margins of his manuscript. "This is why I wanted you as my literary executor," he said finally. "You understand not just what I've written, but what remains to be written." In those final revisions, completed just months before his death, Jung acknowledged more explicitly than ever before that his work represented not an endpoint, but a beginning, an invitation for future generations to continue exploring the feminine dimension of consciousness with ever greater subtlety and respect. The manuscript that left his desk that winter contained his most nuanced thinking on the feminine mind, not as an abstract concept, but as a living psychological reality essential to humanity's future. It stood as testimony to a lifetime of evolving thought, to Jung's willingness to be transformed by the very mysteries he sought to understand.